where we get to hear about all of the great work our MA students are doing. So it's a real pleasure. Our first speaker, I'm going to have Holly, Dr. Horan, do the introduction because she is here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So hi everybody, good to see faces familiar. There's some new people in here that I don't know. I used to be a professor here and now I'm over at UAB. I'm Dr. Holly Horan and I have the pleasure of mentoring Jean Rue for, oh my gosh, hi. Your refreshment. Yeah. So Jean has been a very active research student since their freshman year. They worked with me on a project looking at OASIS, which is a obstetric condition, and the relationship between OASIS and provider and the quality of provider care for high-risk pregnancies. And so we have a paper out in Birth that's published already together, and then they transitioned to their own work after working again on another project with me looking at perinatal self-advocacy. And so today, Jean is talking about their own working with transgender and diverse populations and how they use body modification as a form and expression of bodily autonomy, particularly within hostile climates for people who are teaching and seeking healthcare. So we're so proud of Jean. We're the last leg of your journey as a master's student. So thank you.
What up? Hi. Thanks, Holly, for your introduction. This is the shirt that I actually wore when I first talked to Holly about doing research with her, and I was putting it on. And I was like, oh, the time has passed. So thank you for coming to the Master's Colloquium. This is my thesis, Bodily Autonomy and Stress Management in Transgender and Gender Diverse Populations through Body Modification. Is it a clicky or is it a? I figured it out. So for this thesis, I want to investigate how trans and gender diverse individuals express bodily autonomy through body modifications in relation to stress in healthcare deserts. That's a very long aim. The shortened version is essentially, I want to describe lived experiences of trans and gender diverse individuals in Alabama. This research is very heavily exploratory because there's not a lot of literature explicitly on the transgender experience in Alabama. Yeah, so to investigate this, I'm looking at it through two objectives. So to identify the explanatory cultural models of bodily autonomy in trans and gender diverse individuals, as well as to examine relationships between bodily autonomy, body modifications, experiences of stress, and gender identity in trans and gender diverse populations. So just before I get into these four subfields, I want to talk about my positionality. So as a member of the LGBTQ community, I am non-binary. This research is very near and dear to me, as well as I think it's important to be able to speak with my community, not on behalf of them, but with them in their experiences as trans people in Alabama, which is very well known to be a healthcare desert, not just for primary care, not just for maternity care, but also for gender affirming healthcare. So in case you don't know what a trans person is, trans and gender diverse individuals are people whose gender identity does not align with the gender identity associated with their sex assigned at birth. So typically when babies are born, we assign them a sex at birth. So if you are assigned female at birth as a baby, the gender identity associated with that is womanhood or girlhood. So someone who is assigned female at birth would be trans or gender diverse if they identified as anything other than being a woman or a girl. So bodily autonomy is a subsection of autonomy. So the ability for people to basically defend against indirect or direct interventions, as well as be able to make their own choice with dignity. Bodily autonomy extends that into healthcare. So the ability for people to do that, to make healthcare decisions without interventions from external sources, as well as being able to make decisions without coercion or violence. The United Nations Population Fund actually describes bodily autonomy as being able to act with power, with agency, with choice, and with control. So bodily autonomy for trans and gender diverse individuals is under attack right now legislatively. As of the past few years, there have been significant number of bills banning gender affirming healthcare for various demographics, specifically minors. And along this legislation is also coming abortion and healthcare legislation. And these are both intertwined because they have heavily ties of legislatively restricting the autonomy of individuals in a healthcare setting. So for the sake of this thesis, I wanted to look at experiences of stress for trans and gender diverse individuals. I wanted to look at this through the gender minority stress and resilience model, which is a model that looks at healthcare outcomes when you look at the background of distal stress factors and proximal stress factors, in addition to protective factors, so factors that help mitigate these stressors and help improve health outcomes overall. The social safety and perspective model comes from gender minority stress and resilience model, and it's essentially a model that gives a framework for how trans and gender diverse individuals determine whether or not a situation is safe, and in turn, having that safety helps reduce stress, which helps reduce inflammation, which leads to better health outcomes in the long run. For the sake of this thesis, I wanted to look at body modification as things that you can do to your body that are more permanent than changing clothes, but still a lot more accessible monetarily and just in terms of scheduling than like doing plastic surgery or cosmetic surgery. So haircuts, hairstyles, and hair removal, as well as tattoos and piercings are all body modifications that I look at in the scope of this thesis. So I took a mixed methods approach following participant observation. So I partnered with many locations across Tuscaloosa and Alabama, such as pride organizations like Magic City Acceptance Center, as well as clinics that provide gender affirming healthcare and gender affirming services such as haircuts. And at these locations and pride events held by pride organizations, I distributed a lot of flyers. There's two different types of flyers that are out there. There's some that link to a QR code for a survey, and then some that link to sign up for an interview. So for the interview portion, I ended up interviewing 16 individuals from August of 2023 to February of just this year. And I hand transcribed all of these interviews, and I worked with an undergraduate research assistant, my consensus coder, and we are currently in the process of consensus coding and the thematic analysis of all those 16 interviews. These interviews were semi-structured, and they were anywhere from like 30 minutes to an hour long. And I asked questions about their gender identity, their gender journey, what kind of body modifications do they have if they contribute to their gender expression, as well as asking questions about what kind of stressors they experience in their life relating to being trans. So for the quantitative methods, again, I distributed those flyers, and 63 individuals have opened the survey. So in this survey, it's kind of a blend. It's got the Autonomy Preference Index, which is a index that has two subscales. It's decision making and information seeking. It describes basically how people look for information and make decisions with their doctor collaboratively in the healthcare office, rather than just letting their doctor choose everything for them. The Gender Minority Stress and Resilience Scale is based off of that Gender Minority Stress and Resilience model. It has subsections based on each portion of the model. Basically, it's types of distal stressors, types of proximal stressors, as well as protective factors. So here's some preliminary results, because I am still in the process of doing the data analysis. So for my interview participants, the majority of them were white. The ones that I did ask, I did have a snafu where I forgot to add race and ethnicity into my categories that I collected, and I fixed that with the IRB amendment, but there was some data that I collected prior to that. So for the interviewees that I did ask, they were all white, they were all Hispanic Latino, and every single one of them was college age, anywhere from 19 to 29. So for the gender labels that I have on the right side of the screen here, I made sure to write down the gender labels that they have self-described when I asked, because that is important on an individual level, which is why we see many labels that look like they might be the same thing, but they are individually important to whoever describe them. My favorite is the bottom right, gender fluid, gender fucked, or agender is one of the most unique ones that someone gave to me. Yeah. So I wanted to go through some consensus codes that we've already talked about so far, that we've seen are very prominent in the data. So along these objectives, especially, so objective 1, as a reminder, is that explanatory cultural models of bodily autonomy in trans and gender diverse populations, and the objective 2 is examining the relationships between bodily autonomy, body modifications, experiences of stress, and gender identity. So existence is resistance is a code that I described as participants describe living authentically as a trans person, including living with pride in their identity. Other individuals can also exhibit LGBTQ visibility and make the individual feel more secure or happy. So this individual said, I also grew up in a religious household. My family is Mormon. And so the idea of being transgender was not even something that I was aware existed until middle school. And it certainly was not something that was an option to me at the time. And then the other individual said, my dad, he's pretty conservative. He's always like, you always hear all these sensationalist things in the media about trans people. And it's because he watches Fox News. But he's like, but until you know a trans person, you won't actually have a good point of view on it if you're conservative. So both of these individuals have mentioned that either other people existing as openly trans or themselves existing as openly trans helps push back against anti-trans sentiments that people around them in their lives might experience or might regurgitate back to them. And especially with the first individual actually mentioned that being exposed to people of diverse identities helped them realize that kind of friction in their life of being trans and never knowing it. So the second is community support, and this is a very broad term used to describe individuals that support or surround the participants and allows the participants to live comfortably in their own identity. This individual said, support is a strength in the LGBTQ community. The lesbian who helped me finance a loan said that if the loan didn't go through, she'd pay for my car and have them finance through her. That's insane. That's crazy. She doesn't know who I am. She has to vouch for her through her sister who I work for. But other than knowing I'm just this little transgender kid who has nothing to his name and needs help, she was there. It's crazy. It's good to get support. It's great. Lesbians rule the world. It's also one of my favorite quotes. Specifically, this participant also mentioned like the history of the LGBTQ community, like the reason why we have L at the beginning of the queer community is because of the role that a lot of lesbians played during the AIDS epidemic in nursing the community back to health. This individual was one of the only participants that I had that was completely cut off from their family after coming out, which was incredibly sad, but it also made me glad to hear that there was only one person in that sample of 16. And he had so much support around him. He had so much community support from both the LGBTQ community, so his boss's sister, but also from his friends and from his coworkers and everybody else around him. So the next one is body modifications for autonomy and presentation. So this individual said, for all of my tattoos, I would say I love the self-expression from it. And it helps me in a way to get out the self-expression that I'm not able to do because of the things barring me from transitioning medically. And is to me, like, I know that my parents aren't going to hate me because I got this tattoo of a rabbit, whereas I'm scared that they might not like me anymore if I go on testosterone. So this participant mentions, has not started medically transitioning, but this participant does mention that getting body modifications is a way of changing their body and reclaiming autonomy in a way that could be supplemented by receiving gender affirming healthcare, which they are currently blocked from in a healthcare setting, that they are medically not ready for it. And so the last one is a little bit heavier. Transphobia and queerphobia is it's kind of a self-explanatory code. It's the experiences that individuals face due to anti-trans sentiments. So the first individual said, my mother found out that I was trans by wrestling the suicide note out of my hands. She read it, she stormed out. The first words out of her mouth were, maybe if you thought about doing your homework as much as you thought about gender reassignment, you wouldn't be failing English. Yeah, and then the next one says, I think that all this talk about kids having to get checked before they join a sports team, that's not something that only affects trans people. That's something that affects everybody. That goes in with the saying that trans rights are human rights. Like if one of us is being oppressed, we should all rally around because that means not only are people being mistreated and oppressed, but that they can come for other people next. So both of these individuals mentioned community support as a very strong force as pushing against these anti-trans sentiments. The first individual especially mentions that having that community support that wasn't necessarily just their mom helped them start exploring their gender more, help them start transitioning socially when their mom said that they would. Yeah, so for my survey data, 63 individuals opened the survey and 43 individuals completed it. Of those 20 or so individuals that I removed from the data pool, they either did not qualify for the survey. So to qualify for the survey, you had to be an adult, you had to live in Alabama most of the time, and you had to be trans or gender diverse. Gender affirming healthcare is not available for minors in Alabama, which is why they were not included in the survey. So gender identity was a multi-select category, so at least 30% of all individuals selected non-binary. I still need to do the statistics to see how many selected something else or just non-binary. Again, there is a limitation in that most people who filled out the survey were college age and white. There were a few who were above college age, so anywhere from 30 to 49, and not white, but the majority were. And so for the next steps, I'm still in data analysis. I am chest deep in all of the data that I'm working through, and it's very exciting. And my thesis defense should be scheduled for June 4th of this year, and that should also be public in case you want to go see the final data. And that's it. I'd like to thank my committee. So thank you, Holly, for supporting me through this, as well as Dr. DeCaro, Dr. Chu, and Dr. Lin, who I believe is in Samoa right now. I'd like to thank my consensus coder because he has worked very hard to look at this data with me. And I'd like to thank my community partners and my participants, as well as my lab, for supporting this research and being very interested in seeing how it's going. And to you for listening. Oh, I forgot about questions. Okay, we should do those. Yeah.
I feel like I've been talking to a lot of people about like the current legislative session and how things feel different in recent months. And since your interviews went into February, and also since you're dealing with mostly like young and college age people, I'm curious, if like how people sort of make sense of where we are, and if there's any like pointing towards a trajectory that people are feeling hope or not hope.
It seems like when I was asking about, especially with the legislative session with Senate Bill 129 recently, a lot of my participants did mention that they utilize the safe zone, which is our pride area for UA. A lot of them did mention fear that they would either have to leave the state, or even leave the country due to like the national level of it, since it is not just an Alabama issue, unfortunately. But a lot of them also express sentiment of like, I feel like I have to get out, but I feel like if I do get out, if I do leave, that doesn't change the fact that there are still people here that would need help. And that also doesn't change the fact that it still would be happening regardless of whether or not there. So that's also why that like existence is resistance thing is also part of it, where a lot of them mention that by being here, by being openly trans in this like legislative onslaught, that is still kind of, I guess, pushing back against this idea that, you know, trans people should leave the state or trans people should leave the country or whatever.
There was also a question on Zoom. I think it's Dr. Tober. I think she had her hand raised.
Oh, okay. Dr. Tober, can you hear us? No, just
I would just suggest that.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, I had raised my hand, but then I changed my mind, but I can go ahead and ask it again. I was just wondering if any of the people in your study were thinking down the road about possibly undergoing gender affirming surgical procedures, and if so.
Dr. Tober, if you're speaking right now, you might need to type it in chat because I'm not sure we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
I see you're unmuted. Oh, okay. I guess you wanted to type it. While we're waiting on that typing, anything? Oh, wait. I thought I just saw something. Okay, I can hear Trey all speakers. Okay. Do we have our speakers up? Oh. Okay. We could. They're not working.
That's the room speaker. Could one of you say
Not
something?
needed on
Am I
that.
supposed to speak or am I not?
Maybe. Could one of you say something?
I'll just keep a constant ramble.
Okay.
Dr.
We'll put her on
Tobrow.
speaker.
Are y'all able to hear any of us?
Right, can I?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I put my question in the chat, but I was just wondering if any of her participants were considering gender affirming procedures like surgical procedures in the future that might affect their fertility. And if so, if any of them had considered fertility preservation, whether saving sperm or eggs.
They have not, because a lot of them are college age students, and
A lot of them did not actually mention anything
about, thinking about relationships or thinking about kids, because she can
Oh.
hear.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Oh, I guess she could hear me, so that's a double. I was like, hello? Yeah, like, so a lot of them are college age, so none of them really brought up anything in relation to dating while being trans, as well as like relationships or future trajectories of their relationships while being trans, which is interesting. That is definitely something that I would love to look at in the future, is relationships and dating while you are trans, because there seems to be in the literature and in my real life experience, a lot of people who are trans who date other trans people, because that is a form of community support and rapport.
Great.
Pride study at UCSF. It is the longest standing Pride study. I think it's like longitudinal, so if you are LGBTQ in any capacity, I think they want you to sign up. How long is the question period? It's okay. All right, thank you so much.
We have Patricia? Or sorry, we have Austin. Austin, the other end, sorry.
Next victim.
Whoa,
Yeah.
here comes trouble.
Austin number 2.
Austin number 2.
So Austin is not my MA student, so I'm very pleased to introduce him. Once he got here, he expressed an interest in archaeology, and it sort of made the switch. So starting in the fall, he's going to be a PhD student working with me doing archaeology. But in the meantime, we're going to hear about his MA work, non-archaeology, a tale of 2 precincts, an exploratory analysis of missing person cases.
Hi, well, once again, I'm Austin. I'm your resident true crime sleuth. And I'd like to ask you, when you're on your phone at home, how often do you get an Amber Alert and then immediately turn your phone off and then turn off Amber Alerts? How often does a shared post of an individual's face on your social media, your Facebook, your Instagram, with a bold missing, cross your page and you scroll by? As anthropologists, we are encouraged and further pushed to look for the missing, the unknown, the gap. And further now, forensic anthropologists and regular anthropologists are diving into missing persons literature and looking at cold cases and trying to figure out why these cases become cold, why they fail, why don't they go to completion, and why we don't find these people ever. So in my exploratory analysis, I sought to define missingness initially in 2 counties in Alabama. With case data collection, institutional ethnographies of 2 county sheriffs in Alabama, and more yet to come, I sought not only to compare missingness within the 2 counties, but also to explore the institutions who are executing these searches for missing persons in the hopes of answering the initial thesis question, which became entirely too broad for a master's program. Who is missing and who is missed in the state of Alabama? So our background with missingness has occurred since the birth of this nation. It's occurred pretty much throughout time, but it is defined colloquially by law enforcement in their actual procedures as a state of being where an individual is disappeared for no known reason. Broadly saying, this is a state of unusual absence beyond the norm of the individual's life. As police investigate, I like to treat them as microethnographers. They come in for a solid space of a person's life, gather up as much data as they can, and then make an assumption about what happened, right? Missingness as its topic of concern has been raised up by the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, colloquially name us, who are further pushing forensic anthropologists, especially in the Southeast, where we have criminally large records of missing persons, to get together and to ask and work with police and see why. Why has this person been missing for 30 plus, 40 plus years? Why are your rates so low of completion? But before we get into that, the role of police, as we do have to kind of like simmer ourselves down a little bit before we get accusatory. The role of police is to investigate a case. Ideally, what happens is they get a phone call. A 911 operator gets a phone call that says, my individual, my loved one, and by the way, this has to be from a family or loved one. You have to pretend you're dating somebody if somebody's missing. They will take it seriously. They will get a call and then they will send usually a police officer, in some cases, usually the juveniles and younger, an investigator will directly go out. But they are to investigate that case up until they have sufficient evidence or until they actually find the person. If you can remember, one individual who I'm going to get the name of really quickly, I promise, Garrett Walker. If any of you have been here in the past 2 years and remember Garrett Walker, he was a young university student who was drinking at a bar near the Black Warrior, and he was never found again. They found sufficient evidence, that being his clothes by the banks of the Black Warrior River, to confirm him deceased. That is the extent of the case, sometimes, but that is the role of police. It is to investigate a case. But missing persons, as I said before, in America, has been happening since the beginning. Our first missing person ever recorded is James Harrod of Bedford County, Pennsylvania. I don't have a picture of him because it was 1792, and I didn't want to put a picture of his signature, which was on his will. I thought that was kind of in poor taste. But the first actual missing persons investigation was Marvin Clark of Marion County, Iowa, who disappeared in October 30th of 1926. The cases that began to change things, really changing policy in the United States, often started with young white children. If you were, and not dating you any here, but if any of you are old enough to remember milk cartons with missing children on them, the first one was Eaton Khalil Patz of Manhattan, New York. His father was a photographer, and he used his son's pictures to help spread awareness on milk cartons. And later that would become the modus operandi for about 60 years in the US. If you're old enough to be me and possibly older, you might remember this child's face. This is Adam Walsh, the son of Matt Walsh and John Walsh and Reeve Walsh, who are the founders of America's Most Wanted. Matt Walsh was abducted from a mall and was later found dead 2 weeks later. His missingness, his case was a kind of a tipping point in the US for legislation. We started actually making clearinghouses for missing persons because this was not an abnormal phenomenon at the time. If you can actually probably put every milk carton next to each other, you'll probably have 300 to 400 milk cartons of different missing children's faces. And so that began to push legislation and change things. Another was Jennifer, who will be in a long line of first name laws afterwards, so I'm sorry that the government is not creative when it comes to these things. Jennifer Wilmer of Long Island, New York, who disappeared September 13th, 1993, and would be the cause for Jennifer's Law. Then there was Kristen Modafferi of North Carolina, who disappeared in June 23rd of 1997, who would be the reason for the aforementioned Kristen's Law. Then Suzanne Lyle of Albany, New York, who disappeared March 2nd in 1998, and would subsequently be the reason for Suzanne's Law. And Molly Datillo of Indianapolis, Indiana, who would put into motion Molly's Law that only went forward in Indiana. All of these laws pushed cops to have to report or have to enact when certain elements of the case were being provided, such as Molly's case, where she was an endangered adult. Cops were given information to believe that she was in danger, and they didn't do anything with it, and she was never found. So that made it law in Indiana to actually have to report these things. And so we come to our Alabama missing. So NamUs, the National Missing and Identified Persons System, currently houses 295 missing cases for the state of Alabama. Our oldest case dates to 1959 with Daniel Barter of Lillian, Alabama, who disappeared June 18th. Our most recent case is Megan Grace Frayne of Opelika, Alabama, who disappeared in March 29th, 2024, a few weeks ago. According to NamUs, this is what our state looks like when it comes to missingness. Of course, when we do have these, we have to realize which counties may be resourced and which counties may be under-resourced for housing these cases. If you look at this, the first thing you can notice is that most of the cases are centered around metropolitan areas with very few scattered out, except in Tuscaloosa, where we have 9 cases, scattered out into the rural areas of Alabama. But before we continue on to the case data, we got to talk about the history of policing in Alabama. So American policing has been heavily influenced by its English system throughout the course of history. In the early stages of its development, in both England and colonial America, citizens themselves were responsible for the law enforcement of their communities. So if you remember that old guy in the 1700s and then the 1900s, the citizens themselves as a community were having to go out and look for these individuals up until the law Posse Comitatus in the US, which allowed certain federal jurisdictions and state jurisdictions to conscript individuals, literally deputizing, the thing you see in the Western when people go out to shoot people at the OK Corral, literally deputizing individuals to do the job of a enforcement of a certain law. Following the English precedent set by Sir Robert Peel, who successfully passed the Metropolitan Police Act in London, the United States would follow their erstwhile parent in the establishment of similar entities. However, the explosion of major cities in the 1700s would push us to do certain things that we should probably not be proud of, as in the birth of these slave patrols, especially in the South. Slave patrols first emerged in South Carolina in the early southern region, but historical documents also identify the existence of slave patrols in most parts of the other regions of the South. Samuel Walker identified slave patrols as the first publicly funded police agencies in the American South. Slave patrols remained in place during the Civil War and were not completely disbanded after slavery ended when the military came in during Reconstruction and enforced police law. During early Reconstruction, several groups merged with what was formerly known as slave patrols to maintain control over African-American citizens, effectively becoming the Metropolitan Police in certain areas, as they were considered to have the most veterancy in dealing with the community. While some regard slave patrol as the first formal attempt at policing America, others identify the unification of police departments in several major cities in the early to mid 1800s as the beginning point in the development of modern policing in the United States. For example, the New York City Police Department was unified in 1845. the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department in 1846, the Chicago Police Department in 1854, the Los Angeles Police Department in 1869. These newly created police agencies adopted three distinct characteristics from their English counterparts, which continues on today. One, limited police authority. The powers of the police are supposed to be defined by the law. Two, local control. Local governments bear the responsibility of providing the service of police. And three, fragmented law enforcement authority, which defined the area and created the jurisdictional system that we currently use today, which is confusing and hard to navigate. And I get it, because frankly, if I disappear in Tuscaloosa County, who are you going to call? If I disappear at the mall, apparently you're supposed to call TPD, but you could also call campus police. But if you call the county, they'll direct somebody else. The history of sheriffs, however, dates back a bit further. If you remember Sheriff Nottingham, as the Alabama Sheriff's Association notes, the office of sheriff existed in England as far back as 1066. It comes from the Saxon words scry and reeve. So scry, county, reeve, keeper, so county keeper. Thus the sheriff was the keeper of the county. Though all of this history is here, we must acknowledge Alabama's role in suppression and violence before and during the civil rights movement, and how that still haunts our communities today, and especially how that may affect missing persons cases moving forward. If the community has a historical distrust for you, how likely are you to tell, or how likely are they to tell you that someone is missing versus to go look themselves? The bottom picture is San Francisco, but the top picture is actually the first Tuscaloosa Police Department, the first 5 individuals. So currently in Alabama, we have 67 counties with a total of 417 law enforcement agencies serving and operating in a complex network of jurisdictions. We have 67 sheriff's departments that exist to serve the respective counties and conduct casework and support the city police, which manage the cities proper. These sheriff's departments are characterized by the access or lack thereof of resources needed to conduct successful casework. These may include, but may not be limited to, internet access, workforce and labor, official and unofficial local support via posse comitatus, and more, and way more. Though many rural counties are considered to be these under-resourced counties, counties as large as Birmingham or the counties within Birmingham are often considered under-resourced due to the amount of work, to the lack of manpower that they have. So in my methods, to kind of accurately get a summation of this, we decided to do some case mapping in ArcMap Pro. This consists of last known location mapping. So literally taking the geolocation of where they were last seen, putting a pin there and saying, okay, this is where they were last seen. We also did missing persons case data collection, not only through NamUs and ALEA, the official sources, but through the social media posts of the respective counties. I also did an institutional ethnography that took about 9 months to get 2 interviews. If you want to know how hard it is to work with the police system, we can talk. We, as kind of a reciprocal attitude to give something back to the police so that they could move forward with an educational program, I'm doing a pilot study on the knowledge and attitudes of missing persons and the cases in the local community, that being the UA community. Oh, the interviews. So the interviews occurred with 2 investigators who were veterans of conducting caseworks. Initially, I wanted to work with the sheriffs and speak with the sheriffs themselves, as they are supposed to represent the knowledge and the leadership of the body of the system that they're working within. But with the nature of the sheriff as an elected official, sheriff's experience may differ largely from the officers who are conducting the casework under them. Coding between both interviews, and this is preliminary, I ain't done yet. Coding between both interviews showed a deep similarity between the resourced and under-resourced counties' experience of missing persons cases. CA, or County A, is a high-resource county with many community partnerships and access to resources beyond what they have at hand. Literally, they had a helicopter at one point, they gave it to somebody else so they could get something else. They still have access to the helicopter via a memorandum of understanding. County B, or CB, is a low-resource county whose distance between cities that it manages may be as low as 10 minutes apart and up to 30 minutes apart. They're literally a closet in the city hall of their county. Yet, between these two, the similarities and experiences of cases are what appear most similar. Both counties' experts expressed that their most recurrent missing individuals were juveniles and elders. Both counties conducted similar thorough searches and expressed desires for the public to report immediately the suspicious disappearance of a loved one instead of waiting 24 hours, as is the regular CSI modus operandi. Yet the under-resourced county, CB, professed that all media matters, including news, especially when it relates to missing persons cases, were outsourced to another county, whose travel time between that county and it is approximately 2 hours. County A, on the other hand, handled all of their social media presence themselves, missing persons cases, whatnot, and reshared cases within their own, within the local PDs. It's a very active social media environment, and noted that their greatest strength was not being too large and not being too small, like the county next to them. Another notable difference between the counties are how they cover and begin their casework. Usually, County B will actually try to physically appear, they will apparate. They will try to physically search for the missing person first. County A will most likely contact your relatives beforehand to check with them first. County B will physically contact your relatives. They will literally send a cop to your house, which is different, but they're still working within the bounds of the system and the rules of the system they work with. To contrast this, I took all of the available case data from these two counties. So before we go through this case age distribution, I still have 4 cases whose age was not initially identified on anything, including official servers. So I'm currently in the nature of a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, so I can get those ages. The highest out of a total of 20 cases for County A, the majority of cases sit between the ages of 15 and 40. The highest distribution lies between the ages of 15 and 30, with 2 15-year-olds and 6 adults between the ages of 19 to 26. In total, 11 adults ages to 19 to 59 make up the largest portion of the population. And if this cutoff confuses you, it's because there were names there. Sorry, can't give you that. Of note in this data, 4 of the 20 cases, I told you that. What am I saying? All right. So by completion of the case, found and not found, we literally have an even 50-50 split. 10 cases in County A have individuals that were successfully found, but also 10 that are completely in cold case storage. Distribution by race or ethnicity shows a distribution of 12 white Caucasian individuals, 7 African Americans, and 1 unknown 15-year-old whose original case file was moved at the request of their parents by the police, not directly to me. Our targeted distribution of race and ethnicity shows that 2 African Americans within this case remain not found and in cold case storage, with 5 African Americans successfully found. Within the population of white and Caucasian, we have 8 individuals who remain in cold case storage unfound, and 4 white Caucasian individuals who have been found. County B has 1 missing persons case available to the public, publicly available. It is a 31-year-old African-American male who's been missing since October 6th, 2016. This may be due in some part to the outsourcing of their media to other counties, which I will extrapolate on later. So what I found currently with the data I have is that there are 2 present realities within this data set. One is what we publicly can see. All the cases that we can see say that the majority of people who go missing are between the ages of 18 and 40, so young adults, or 19 and 40. And then there is the experience of the police, whose everyday experience, whether successful or not in their cases, often leads them to think, at least between these two individuals that I currently have, that elders and juveniles are the ones who go missing the most often. And this most likely is from their day-to-day mundane experience. Once again, the cases I'm working with are not all the successes and are mostly failures, right? We have an even split here. I don't see the case that was not put on social media or was not put to NamUs, because that case came to success and was not social media was not used as a tool to present this information to the public. So we have one, what we the public can see, and two, the police, what they can see. And those are two truths, truths that don't conclusively really say anything about the county and what missingness is in the state of Alabama. What it does say, however, is that I got more work to do. So currently, I am working on the mapping of the last known location for cases. I have been lucky enough to be approached by family members on social media after connecting in with these missing persons groups on last known locations, like physically the point where they were last seen. I need to complete this pilot survey, IRBB willing, that of the knowledge and attitudes course. I have to complete a thesis defense. And I have to continue this relationship with County A and County B Sheriff's Departments, because they, in truth, hold all of the case data. And whatever I think, my positionality, being a young Romani American man who has a side of the family that are unrepentant moonshiners and rednecks, obviously have opinions when it comes to policing and the police. However, this reciprocal relationship that we have built with them has been good, and we need to maintain it, and we need to keep it so that we can change things moving forward while also acknowledging the history of the institution itself. And finally, what we're doing now, I'm working with Dr. Jesse Goliath at Mississippi State University to establish a local database that can be used and managed to store long-term case data and work on studies moving forward and try to figure out what missingness in Alabama looks like. And then I have to figure out how to functionally and mentally pivot to archaeology after this. And that's it. I was gonna have like a momentary picture slideshow, but then I realized that I can't do that without exposing the counties that these cases came from. So we're not gonna do that.
Question, when you say they were found, is it found living or dead?
Both. There are 3 individuals who were found deceased, and 7 individuals found alive and safe, one with a very pissed off mother.
This is probably my own curiosity, but have you seen anything about the impact of true crime podcasts? Like, is there actually any impact?
Actually, yeah, one of my interviewees talked about that. He has expressed a desire to see more internet sleuths working with departments, because he and his wife are like, that's so cool that they have all this time on their hands. So yes.
No, that one, I lost it, match me.
Okay.
Is there a distinction made maybe in the database, between what the police think might have happened, like this is a runaway, this is a kidnapping, this is accidental death?
So yes, actually, if you are between the ages of 14 and 15, you are automatically classified as a runaway. However, police notes are not put in publicly available data like on NamUs. You typically get the familial notes or the personal notes. Last seen here, wearing this, in this car, going this fast.
But they don't categorize them.
But they don't categorize them in that way. Those are supposed to be for the investigator anecdotal notes. You got one now?
So in terms of your like pilot research that you're going to be doing, I'm guessing you're looking into research on like risk-taking behavior, because it looks like, you know, of course, the greatest population is in like younger individuals, like adolescents to young adults. I'm classifying 35 as young adult people.
Okay. Okay,
So-
that makes me feel better.
Yeah, me too. But, you know, these, and there are studies out there about risk-taking behaviors in those populations. I mean, have you found any of that?
So
yet,
the
or-
missing person's attitude score is actually just what you know, what you as an individual know, what to do. So I'm asking questions like, how long do you wait before you,
Oh,
call in a case? You won't be surprised to hear a lot of people say 24 hours. It's a myth, it's a lie. You're not supposed to do that.
Have you looked into like, I know that it's probably within the last like decade or so, police departments, or maybe more than that. That they started saying, don't wait 24 or 48 hours.
Yes.
So I would like to know like which precincts are actually still telling people on, you know, on 911, no, have you waited 24 hours? Go back tomorrow. You know?
It is characterized as rural and under-resourced, often doing it as certain counties do not have the manpower to take on another case and will in fact deflect. We can try and call a couple if you want and see how many do it.
So.
But we could get arrested for
In
that
the
too.
Davis, map that you had, was there an overlap in sundown counts as well?
I actually didn't look at, that's really interesting. I did not look at that. Nor I was really just kind of like picking up between the two counties, giving a very like compare and contrast. But that's interesting.
Because Alabama's full of them, so, yeah.
That's interesting. I'll get a pen and get on that. Anybody else?
sorry, I have a question about your question, actually. Yeah. Sorry. So are you saying, like, are you asking?
Wrap it up.
Is NamUs, like, is there a link between like the creation of things like NamUs and sundown town? I was wondering if like.
Yeah, let me
looks like
also look at
people are
the.
pointed as the same on the place.
Okay.
It overlap, it was, okay,
Okay.
Sundown counts in Alabama.
yeah.
You're welcome.
That would be interesting.
Perfect. It's perfect. Yeah, it's beyond images for the beginning. Is that okay?
I didn't know, sorry, I missed the first part, I didn't know what we were going to. Hi, everyone, I'm pleased to introduce to you all the wonderful Patricia and Matthew. I find it difficult to classify you as a particular type of anthropologist. I would say that Patricia is very interdisciplinary. She has a lot of diverse interests, particularly in looking at food systems and looking at the environment. She does a lot of side projects, making her work on farm as well as foodscape that some of you have heard about. And so she's a jack of all trades in many respects and has been doing her thesis work looking at botanical remains from the site of Moundville. So with that said, Patricia, please go ahead.
Feels like jack of all trades and master of none. Questions about that in this, presentation, sort of like what people are seeing as some through lines. But I'm going to start with a vignette of one of my favorite foods growing up. Yes, here's a photo of it. Or here's a photo of it. I invite you to sort of think about the parts of this that are recognizable to you and parts that seem foreign. Here it is again, which might look more recognizable, or here's when it's ripe. This is obviously an industrial combine that's harvesting corn, and the combine takes the kernels off of the cob by themselves. That needs to go to a mill, which is made into cornmeal, so that I could go to a grocery store as a kid and purchase Jiffy cornbread. Archaeologists call these foodways, which is to say that we're interested in the food itself, but also the activities, the rules, and the contexts and the meanings contained therein. Archaeologists are interested in the production of food, but also the processing, the plating, and the consumption. And so foodways are really big and complicated. So there were probably moments of the Jiffy photo collage that felt foreign to you, but they're also personal, which is why I start with Jiffy, because I thought it would insult some Southerners here. Events, which is a really loaded term anthropologically, and one that I don't think my work is fully aligned with all of the ramifications, has been a useful way for me to think about discrete moments like a singular meal or a singular pit, where larger foodways can be expressed. So events are a prism through which change and continuity can become observable. Solins calls events enigmatic, and Cobb, who writes on eventful archaeology of the Southeast, says we're subject to the whims of our available data. And both of these quotes resonate with me because my work doesn't feel particularly historic or change-oriented or comparative, but it does feel loyal to sort of the humble questions of asking what's happening in a particular constellation of humans and plants in one slice of time. So, as you may know, I study paleoethnobotany, which is the study of plants in the archaeological record. I do so at Moundville, which is an ancestral homeland of many indigenous groups in the Southeast. So I'll start with some background on Moundville, talk about my methods, and then my data. Moundville is a place that's marked by dynamism between 1020 and 1650, which is easily twice the age of the United States. Moundville underwent sweeping social and political shifts. Populations intensified and dispersed, political power coalesced and shifted, and autonomy was consistently negotiated by individuals and groups. Significant technological changes in ceramic and craftware and in food procurement map on well with these demographic changes. The landscape is also marked by dynamism. Trees were cut down, resources were tended and managed, and most strikingly, tons of soil were moved to form the earthworks that give Moundville its name. And change at Moundville extends to its scholarship as well. There has been over a century of archaeology at the site, and interpretations have changed over this period. I had a piece of consultation in my thesis, which ended up taking 7 months. And so, unable to start my lab work during this time, I got more serious about my interest in academic history, intellectual discourse, and the particular politics of Moundville interpretations. And this gets to the jack of all trades, master of none. I'm still trying to figure out how to weave my plant work with this part of my work because they feel kind of like two separate stories right now. But if you've taken Ant 625, you're probably familiar with Squire and Davis's book on the mound builders, or the work of amateur archaeologist C.B. Moore, both of whom did work at Moundville. But I like to start the story of Moundville with Nathaniel Thomas Lupton, who was an Alabama professor and archaeologist. He made the first map of Moundville, which is there on the right. And he sent some letters to the Smithsonian Institute when he sent in this map. And he wrote about the luxuriant growth on top of Mound B, which was and is the biggest mound. And in particular, one tree measuring nearly 3 feet in diameter. And to me, this makes a lot of sense because trees like to grow on hills, and if they're left alone, they'll grow in these sort of like unique drainage environments. The fact that there aren't trees there today should signal that it's a really managed landscape. It's one that's owned by our university, it's extensively mowed, and so forth. And also the ethnohistoric documents that suggest trees were not growing on these mounds centuries previously also signal that the built environment historically was quite managed. Another reason I like to start with Lupton is because he was writing as a Southerner at the tail end of the Civil War, and his letters to the Smithsonian Institute often asked for books and ways to be reintegrated into the academic milieu, feeling left behind by the stain his geography's white supremacy had on his scholarship. After Lupton, C.B. Moore came, farmers plowed the land and grew crops on it, it was made into a state park, excavations were undergone to make the roads that now run through the park. UA hired Dr. DeJarnett to work in the anthropology and sociology departments, and more. Archives from the Crimson White share that honor societies had induction ceremonies at Moundville, thousands of visitors came through, and many more. One article said over 100,000 annually came to the Natural History Museum on campus, which displayed artifacts from Moundville, including a skeleton. But in 1964, so a century after Lupton's map, a PhD student at Harvard called Moundville virtually unknown. They weren't far off in saying that there was a need for rigorous scholarship and an integrated analysis, but calling it unknown feels not fully true, but speaks to the challenges of talking across geographies and across disciplines. So Lupton, looking for legitimacy as a Southerner after the Civil War, to me so strongly mirrors the continued ways that academic communities of practice are reified. And so after the 1960s, it feels like there were two really big waves of Moundville scholarship. The first is in the 1980s, where the ceramic chronology, chiefdom modeling, and paleoethnobotanical scholarship were all undertaken to better understand Moundville. This work is really heavily influenced by political economy. It feels like they're all citing really similar sources. If you've TA'd for 102, it uses Earl Service's 1960s work on chiefdoms in Hawaii. And a lot of this heavy lifting and agenda setting was done by like key doctoral dissertations that are like listable by hand. And then sort of this critique and backlash came in the 2000s where people said chiefdoms aren't so simple. Contemporary Hawaii models may not be an appropriate proxy for prehistoric Southeast. People returned to Moundville with new interpretive lenses. And so just as the former scholarship was like 2 decades behind Earl Service's, these scholars who are citing Verdue and Giddens seem to be doing it a couple decades after those first came out. Some of them call themselves practice archaeologists, some historical processualists. I very tentatively use the word events, but they all are interested in observable moments or constellations, as I offered earlier, that might explain larger structures. I have to believe that part of this may have come from the passing of NAGPRA and the popularization of household and domestic spaces rather than the beautiful, ornate, and typically burial context that archaeologists previously worked with. I think it has to also do maybe with the professionalization of archaeology and an increase in academic output, particularly the University of Alabama at the master's thesis level. But overall, just as Stephanitis and his friends were immersed in the political economy of the 1980s, I can see at UA that we're immersed in practice and daily life in our UA training, and it makes total sense in a nerdy academic historian way that these are some of the tools that are helping me make sense of really complicated foodways. So the Moundville that I was inheriting intellectually was one in flux. There were a lot of debates about the site. I shared the Lupton map earlier. Here's a map from the 1930s, which includes sort of the northeast area by the river, a mound that wasn't on Lupton's map, and my samples come from excavations that were undertaken there. Before discussing paleoethnobotany, I think it's useful to think about taphonomy. Donnell in 1976 pointed out that what makes it into the archaeological record is usually what is not eaten. So if we think back to the Jiffy foodway and take out the industrial combine and just replace that with our hands, cupules, kernels, and glooms would all be visible in the archaeological record. But the gloom is often too fragile to survive Alabama's acidic soils, and often the kernel gets eaten. So we're left with cupules, and the only ones that survive are ones that are carbonized and then covered in soil and happen to be in the location where archaeologists dig and an area where researchers take soil samples from, which in this case was every single feature of the site, so that is good. Those soil samples are put in a flotation tank, which agitates the material, and organics float to the top to be skimmed off, and inorganics sink to the bottom. This photo makes it look like I did many flotations, but I literally floated less than 1 liter of many samples that previous students had already processed. Those samples need to come back to campus, to come to the Ancient People and Plants Laboratory, go through geologic sieves, be put under a microscope, and then one little cupule looks like this. And they're often found with lots of other cupules, lots of varying sizes, and a whole lot of other junk like sand and bug parts and leaves as well. So my research looks at what isn't eaten, what gets fired, what archaeologists excavate, so it doesn't get destroyed by the flotation tank, which is pretty good, but never perfect, which is greater than the size of the sieves, and what I pull out from this jumble. So on to my findings.
My first one is that the samples come from late Moundville, which came from radiocarbon dates. This is helpful because previous lab work that was looking at that area of the site, which I was going to shout out Carrie, but Carrie's not here, couldn't really diagnostically identify a time period for those in the radiocarbon class, which is not me. If you want to look at this Excel sheet and it means anything to you, or that table, basically it's this time period called Moundville 3, and it's about 1400. This is really interesting for me because there's very little plant data available from this time. In my contexts, it's like about as many as have previously been done on Moundville 2 and Moundville 3 combined. This is the time at Moundville when populations have dispersed. So sort of like thinking about the chronology of Mound Z and other analysis from the Riverbank process are outgoing, but immediately like those were very exciting radiocarbon dates to get. Part of the reason that research was done on that area by the river, and I'm back to a different map that loses Mound Z again, is that there was like, yeah, the riverbank was eroding, but also this question of what Mound Z is it a mound? And so excavations found this yellow clay fill, which is anthropogenic. And in theory, plants could say something interesting about what was happening before, like above it and below it, but I just found charcoal in those samples, which is not that interesting. This like dark stain on the left-hand side is where one of the radiocarbon dates come from. So we know that the yellow fill, this like base of Mound Z, was done before the stain in between 1440 and 1470. And the stain had corn and sumpweed in there. But it's sad that the other plants don't line up interesting with the stratigraphy. In a separate unit, there was sort of interesting plants in the sense that there's like cultivated maize, cultivated maize, cultivated maize, and then it just stops, but it didn't line up with stratigraphy at all. And instead there's just a whole bunch of features in the first meter. And so the features might offer a better lens for thinking about what's happening there. My next conclusion is that there's a lot of corn. It's by far the most ubiquitous, which makes sense because work in the 1980s showed that it significantly changed Moundville life, and work in the 2000s showed that technological changes facilitated this change. So whatever interpretive lens you're using, the corn shows up. There were far more cupules than kernels, which isn't typical at peak Moundville, which in sort of like the traditional chiefdom model, corn is being processed elsewhere, brought into the polity, and is being distributed by the chief. Late Moundville, which is where these samples are coming from, the populations have dispersed, so it's possible processing is happening on site more frequently, which would explain why there are these cupules. In the base of this one pot, there were over 2,000 cupules, which was exciting, but doesn't make a ton of sense to me when I think about like a hominy foodway where cupules would be discarded. But there's a lot of ways that corn can be consumed, and some involve roasting ear of corn, roasting ears of corn, or storing ears of corn. And also cupules are just more durable and last in the archaeological record longer. The corn ranges in size dramatically, and I'm still working on some quantifying and thinking about comparative work. There's also sumpweed in the samples, which was domesticated further north. There's no evidence that they were domesticated down here, and I agree with that. All the sumpweeds look really different and have different sizes, which makes me wonder if all of them are sumpweed, or if whenever I see something triangular, I just call it sumpweed. I feel good that I'm not doing that too excessively because, for example, in that like 2000 corn cupule sample, there was no sumpweed, but I definitely think some might be sedges. So for example, this is a photo of something that an expert, Dr. Dana Bartle, helped me identify as sumpweed, but to me does not look like the sumpweed image on the list very much, but weedy things look different. There's also hickory in my sample. Previous work makes me think that hickory should be super ubiquitous, but it's really not. So it's possible that there were nut groves or nut processing elsewhere, but that doesn't make a lot of sense given the cupules that sort of signal maybe a more localized food production system. I have to wonder if it's a skill issue, if I am, too afraid to call charcoal hickory. So I'm still sort of thinking with that. And then there's other plants too, like this weird thing that looks maybe like a mallow and like a really, really weedy bean. And I've seen a handful of that guy on the right, which is starting to make me nervous that it might be a bug instead. So overall, my taxa list is far shorter than what the previous Moundville 2 and Moundville 3 work suggests. But thinking about events has sort of freed me from the burden of having to say anything too profound about monocropping or over-reliance on one food source or anything like that, because really I'm just looking at a few very small events that tell us interesting things. So in conclusions, the samples are from late Moundville. There is a lot of corn in them. There definitely is hickory and some weed, but I'm not sure how much. And I'm in the middle of the writing process, which is why this feels a little bit more where I am in the moment. And that's all.
Can you please speculate wildly? What do you think is going on in that context where there's so many conflicts? Is this coming from exactly like a pot you said, or
Yeah,
is that I don't know, 50 corn cobs or jams in there that were all cooked? What do you think?
I have no idea. Yeah, that feels possible. It feels like people love talking about hominy. So in my head, I'm like, hominy is the food that people ate, but that's not true. And there's like this Choctaw recipe that I was looking at where they, it involved like roasting corn inside of a pot. But that pot in so much of the other archaeological literature is like, that's like the perfect size for hominy food. So I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
So all of these 2,000 cupules, is this from that?
It's from 1 liter.
That's
1
not
liter.
counting the feature 11 text.
That, yeah. I don't have a photo of it, but no, not this one. Yeah. I'm trying to think if I have a photo of it, and I don't think I do, but yeah, just in that 1 liter. And there's like hundreds in the feature beyond that, and like nice, I don't know when you call a cob, but like nice blooms that are stuck together too.
And is that recipe for roasting them, is that in book?
No, but I should look, because I bet that there's also good recipes in there. Yeah. Yes.
Did you happen to find any unusual taxa, any like faunal taxa or just anything out of the ordinary?
There was at least one burned bone that I was like, this looks like really weird hickory, and it was not hickory. But and there were a couple other, like, I'm thinking of a long bone in one of the samples, but I haven't really endeavored to even try to identify any of them. If anyone has ideas about the history and the food ways, I would like to have both have a footprint in my thesis, but I'm not sure how to do that yet.
Or the pieces of them like dating or like this size things. Oh, I think so. Like ribbons. If you want someone to look at it,
I'm okay with it.
Okay.
That's a good height. There you go.
Oh my God, my
You gotta love these desks, it's like the hydraulic lift. It's
I
nice.
love the.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry.
Dude, it's really nice. I can actually lean on it. Like, fancy.
Right, now my pleasure to introduce author number one. And did I meet you when you were a freshman?
No, second semester freshman year.
Yeah,
I
second
very
semester.
anxiously walked into your office, like, hey, I want to do archaeology.
And started working in my lab and now is presenting on his thesis work on Creighton Island, Creighton Island shell ring, and a lot of really fun shovel tests.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so those of you that were here for my Fable in the fall, you'll see a lot of, I took my Fable presentation and reworked it for this. You'll see a lot of familiarity or some stuff you've seen before, a lot of new stuff. Gotta keep the picture. This thing's awesome. All right. So yeah, title of my thesis research is Beyond the Ring, a multi-method analysis of the reuse of the Creighton Island shell ring, Georgia, 9MC87. Oh, arrow doesn't work. Maybe it doesn't. There we go. All right, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of like geography, a little bit like putting us in place, and then we'll get into background, theory, method, all that. So I'm going to start off talking very broadly about the Georgia Bight, which is, it's a region of coastline that extends from Cape Fear, North Carolina to Cape Canaveral, Florida, and is defined by a long chain of barrier islands and back barrier marshes. And our focus is we're going to zoom in on the Georgia coast and talk about this area right here, the Sapelo Sound and the areas surrounding it, right there with Sapelo Island and St. Catherine. So, all right, so Georgia Bight shell rings. So along the Georgia Bight, there are these examples of some of the earliest monumental architecture in the United States in the form of shell rings. They date to the late Archaic period. It's about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And they're also associated with the earliest pottery known in the US, the fiber-tempered St. Simon's type. So they are very clearly the result of deliberate deposition of marine shell, primarily oyster. And they range a lot. There's, I think within, I'm not gonna say it because I'm gonna get the number wrong, but they're very well concentrated, especially along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts, but you find them down in Florida as well, a little bit in North Carolina. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that they range in size, they can range in size by a lot. They can be anywhere between 50 to 250 meters across, roughly, and they can be any sort of shape, circles, ovals, horseshoes, U's, and C's. That's more or less a direct quote. And you can see here, this is the Creighton Island shell ring, where we have a nice little crescent there. That is, I should preface, that's a LiDAR imagery of the south end of the island. All right, so timeline, we're going to talk about time a little bit, and this comes from work that was done in 2008 as a part of work done by the American Museum of Natural History. And this took pre-existing ceramic typology, ceramic seriation that had been the product of decades of work, and sought to really refine with calibrated radiocarbon dates some of these ages and sequences. So St. Simon's, Refuge, Deptford, Wilmington, St. Catherine's, Irene, and the elusive Savannah type, which I will talk about, they all sort of stretch across the late Archaic, woodland, Mississippian periods. They're defined by certain ceramic types with their own specifics. But through radiocarbon dating and sort of comparison, they have been given these sort of breakdowns of dates. All right, so specifically talking about Creighton Island, Georgia, like I said, mentioned here, right around the Sapelo Sound area with St. Catherine's Island and Sapelo Island. Really quick, I'm going to give you a little background of how the back barrier works, because Creighton Island is found within this back barrier region. It might be a bit hard to see because of the light and everything is so green, but essentially this is your coastline, this is your back barrier marsh region, and then your barrier islands. So essentially how this worked is after the last glacial maximum starting about 18,000 years ago, you had this relatively quick rising sea level. And before that point in the back barrier, there was evidence of sort of these freshwater lagoon types in the back barrier, but about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, as the coastline began to stabilize, salt water from the Atlantic Ocean had rushed over some of these, the barrier islands and some of these structures, and had filled those freshwater lagoons with salt water, which ended up creating these very rich marine salt marshes, which you can find loads of oysters, tagless, different types of shellfish. And then amongst that, we have Creighton Island, which itself has a long history of occupation going anywhere from what we're going to be speaking about here, the late Archaic region, all the way up to, post-Civil War, more modern times. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this island. All right, so a little bit more specific about the island, as I sort of alluded to through the LiDAR image earlier, the Creighton Island shell ring is located on the extreme southern end of the island. Again, as I sort of showed, it's this crescent horseshoe shape with its opening, quote unquote, facing southwest into the marsh. And the shell ring itself measures about 60 feet north to south, 130 feet east to west, and 8 feet thick. And past some work done in the 70s and more work done recently as part of the work here at UA, the shell ring has been relatively unexplored. So here's another just like shaded relief LiDAR image, which shows some of the features in this area. It pops a bit more. So what I'll be discussing a lot in the rest of this presentation here is, while you have the main ring structure, there also is, and you can see it on the surface, there is this, what I call the arm of shell. I haven't found a great word to describe it. I call it the arm of shell, that essentially comes off the ring and begins to go up the southeastern end of the island, begins to taper off. So keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that. All right, so a little bit on my background. So I'm centered on understanding how the Creighton Island shell ring was reused and reoccupied past its initial late Archaic construction. There's all of these rings in this Georgia Bight, Georgia coastal area have all date to the late Archaic period in their construction, and how they, in that period, occupation is fairly well known that it happened, but there's not a lot of complete research done looking at how those areas were continued to be used. There's a whole list of researchers and work done where they mention that there appears, ceramics or different evidence of later use at these sites, but there's not a big focus in specifically exploring those processes. That's what I'm hoping to do here with the little snippet that is the Creighton Island shell ring. So I'm sort of broken down into 3 parts. The first of which we've kind of started to talk about, and we'll talk about a little bit more, which is the late Archaic and woodland Georgia coast, specifically looking at the terminal late Archaic and that shift between the late Archaic and woodland period and some of the intricacies with that. Also, a little bit of a background on the northern Georgia coast ceramics, which becomes a big impact just on the numbers of different ceramic types in the area, which I wasn't planning on focusing as long on, but as we'll see, my ceramic analysis kind of forced that, because I found a lot of different diverse different ceramics. And then also sort of my theory direction here, looking at persistent plates, but also supported by monumentality and social memory. So I'll very briefly, I will start with so we're going to return to this timeline real quick. So as I was sort of mentioning, I'm focusing in on this late Archaic woodland transition. So in the St. Simons period, where you have those, the shell rings are being built, you have the earliest occupations, you have these fiber tempered St. Simons ceramics. And this occupation is created by the fact that, you have these rich back barrier resources that are giving local people the ability to, utilize these areas and have close access to resources. Well, about 2300 to 1600 BC, the sea level began to rebound a little bit, and it dropped as much as about 2 meters. And that had a disastrous effect where it actually led to the loss of those back barrier resources. So from about 1600 to 1000, which as you see here is sort of the end of the St. Simons late Archaic period, the coastal back barrier enters this area, or enters this time known as the terminal late Archaic, where populations are being dispersed, they're moving all over, they're searching for new resources, new places to live. And you're also seeing it's very difficult to find where these populations are going, because much of the evidence is found in shell deposits, and the shell is disappearing. So there's a lack of evidence of being able to track movement because it's hard to find the sites. But what we do see is we'll put a pin in that. I'll come back to that. So we'll go here first. We'll talk about ceramics first. So so we'll go back to this. So as I mentioned, each of these periods correspond to a certain type of ceramic that's identified on the coast. And they're also divided by the types of temper that are found in the ceramics. And again, I only mention this because it'll become important later when we look at the results. So the St. Simon's period is defined by fiber temper. It's the only time, it's the earliest period in the sequence. It's the only time it's ever used. And then after that transition into the woodland period, the following refuge and Deptford periods are both characterized by a combination of different varying degrees of sand to grit, sometimes very sandy, sometimes very gritty, sometimes in between, as the temper that's put inside ceramics when they're fired. And then during the Wilmington and St. Catharines phases, so the end of the woodland, beginning of the Mississippian, and those two, it's not like clear cut end of the woodland, beginning of the Mississippian. The Wilmington and St. Catharines sort of bleed. I believe it's Wilmington bleeds over a little bit into the early Mississippian. But anyways, both of those periods are dominated by clay temper, which is, low fired clay or previous ceramics that are broken up that are then included as the temper. And then we see during the Savannah period, which fits in here but doesn't have a time necessarily associated with it, and the Irene period, you see a return of the sort of sand and grit with a higher emphasis on grit and sort of gravelly. So again, sort of, I know it's a lot, it's kind of complex. Keep it in mind because we'll come back to it. And then to quickly go back and revisit sort of my theoretical focus. So all of this information is being tied together to the idea of persistent place, which is defined in 1992 by Schlanger as persistent places persistent place describing places that are neither strictly archaeological sites nor features of the landscape. And instead, they come to represent spaces whose purpose and function attracted continued reuse and reoccupation that is highlighted by the presence of cultural materials. So the gist of that is, and what I'm focusing on, which goes very well with my aim here, is looking at the understanding of reuse and reoccupation, is seeing how the threads of these reuse and reoccupations correspond with the landscape, or with the shell ring as a feature of landscape and an archaeological site, and how that's used and reused with that area. All right, so this is another graph pulled from that 2008 work that I mentioned earlier, and this is focused on St. Catharines Island, but has some good information to tell about the back barrier. So as you can see, so these here, they're pooled, it's a pooled radiocarbon probability. So essentially, the higher the peaks you have, it's the more some probability of finding radiocarbon material, which corresponds to, if you have more radiocarbon material, you have more people, basically. So where those peaks are is where there's higher, population is happening, and there's higher. But what's sort of important for us is this western estuarine marsh here, which that's going to be your back barrier marsh. And you can see that with the estimated sea level change that I mentioned up there between 2300 to 1600 BC, it ends up dropping, and by, in about that 1600 BC area, that the shell or the western estuarine marsh disappears, and that shell is supposed to be gone. But then you see this rebound coming right about the 350, 400 AD area, which is when the back barrier marshes are supposed to reemerge, and that shell, that we use as a sign of, predicting occupation through the appearance of these sites, that's where it's supposed to come back. And I make this distinction because that 350 BC date is sort of laid out as, it's the conventional understanding of when the shell is supposed to be returned or supposed to come back. But, my research sort of challenges that a little bit. All right. So once again, here is just a picture of the southern end of the island, and then the LiDAR. I've already talked about this before, but you have your main construction and that arm of shell that I talk about. And that goes into our methods. So I employed a series of field and laboratory methods. Obviously, this is a shovel test map. I plotted 91 shovel tests at 10-meter intervals that were dug over 3 field seasons, all within 2023 in March, June, July, and October. And so that was the shovel tested survey. Also, another thing that I have done that I have not, I haven't interpreted the data yet, I haven't put it in the map and worked with it, is I also went through with a handheld GPS, well, on a rod GPS, but plotted the boundaries of shell deposits that are visible on the surface. So I'll talk about here a little bit when I go through my results, but a lot of it, and you can also see it in the LiDAR where you have that, that more red where there is these rises where the shell is. There's a lot of shell exposed on the surface, and it's in certain areas, but in this whole area up till about right here-ish, that whole area has some sort of underground shell deposits. I mean, you have places that you hit and there's nothing there, but you have other places where it's not visible on the surface, but you could have, 30 centimeters of shell underground. And then after all of this excavation was done, I went back to the lab. I did artifact cataloging and analysis, and then also did radiocarbon dating and oxygen isotope analysis, which we'll talk about all of that later. All right, so here are the results. This is just a very basic result map that I made up, showing the important thing to draw here is that all those black dots are positive shovel tests. I did not have a single negative shovel test. And you go from anywhere where there's a bunch of faunal bone, like bone remains, animal bone, to there being a bunch of ceramics, to there being as little as 15 centimeters of shell, but that shell still got there somehow. So it's evidence that something was going on here. So outside of the ones that I didn't dig, either they were too close to the water or different reasons, something was found everywhere. All right, so this is a lot, but this is the beginning of some of my artifacts, some of these stuff that I found. I identified 317 prehistoric ceramics, 9 what I call historic non-indigenous ceramics, because on Creighton Island on the north end, there's a significant Spanish Mission era population that there are ceramics found up there that are indigenous ceramics that we would be considered, historic period. So I sort of use this term, essentially it's, Euro-American historic ceramics. And I found 9 of those, 13 pieces of fired clay, and then I broke down, all this is a lot, but I broke down all of the prehistoric ceramics by fiber temper, fiber temper, but by temper. So, about a quarter of all the ceramics I recovered were fiber tempered for that St. Simon's plane, which is easy because if it's fiber, it's St. Simon's. It makes it really easy to type it. And then I have about 50% were sand and grit, which again, at least for me, maybe if I was a bit more experienced and confident, I would be able to parse out what's more sand, what's more grit, and some of the intricacies in between. But 50% is, sand and grit. So that can be anywhere from some of that early woodland refuge plain, Depper check stamp, into some of the later, Irene plain and such. I also found 4.7%, 15 were clay tempered, which based on some of the results that I'll talk about with the radiocarbon dating, I would have thought I would have found possibly a little bit more, and I didn't. And then also miscellaneous, which I had 56 of those were sherdlets, which were just pieces of ceramic that were smaller than ½ an inch. So they were just put in their own little category. And then also those historic non-indigenous ceramics, I had 7 whiteware, 1 yellowware, 1 porcelain, which they don't do much to the overall study of the thesis, but they're interesting. All right, so here are 2 maps that show the distribution of both prehistoric ceramics on the left and those historic ceramics on the right. So you can see that across the area, there's a pretty consistent ceramics found. There's not really, other than some, maybe some plain areas there's not really much of a pattern other than it's everywhere. Also on the very top left there, I noted where coastal plain chert was found, which are lithics that were found on the island. And that's interesting because there's no naturally occurring rock on these back barrier islands. So that meant that somebody was going somewhere, trading and bringing back coastal plain chert to use. All right, and I also did one thing I didn't mention when I was talking about my methods in the field is that for every shovel test that I was digging, I was digging the shovel test in 20 centimeter levels to sort of keep intact some of these levels and some of these ceramics together so they could be looked at better individually. I was also weighing all of the shell that was in those areas, which I did. I was weighing in kilograms and I converted it just because I was like, I'm bad at like visualizing kilograms. And for some of these in the south here, some of these more dense areas, I was finding as much as 600 pounds of shell in one 45 centimeter wide, 80 centimeter deep hole. So Patricia, yes, her reaction is everything, because both her and Austin were really with me on those bad ones. But anyways, to bring it back, so this is just sort of a heat map showing some of the shell density that we are. So obviously this area is blank right here because that's the shell ring. I wasn't sampling there. But you can see the density roughly outlining that arm of shell that I had talked about. And then you have some of these really interesting, like random little individual middens there, and there. And some more slightly denser up there. Oh, wow. Okay, those are supposed to be triangles. Okay. So if you can see the little orange peaks, which without them being triangles, it's kind of hard to see, those are the fiber tempered ceramics plotted on top of the shell density. And I did this for a specific reason, because we know that the shell ring itself was used in the late Archaic period, but the area surrounding the shell ring, theoretically, if it's being used and reoccupied after the late Archaic and the Woodland and Mississippian periods that I've talked about, and the earlier map that I showed with all of the ceramics plotted obviously proves that this whole area was being used later. It's interesting the spread to which I found the fiber tempered, because a lot of research done in this area talks about how very often during the late Archaic, the exteriors of the rings weren't heavily used. They were supposed to be more of these underused areas, and most of the intensity of activity was happening in the ring. So it's interesting to find, there's a big cluster up here, which is really interesting. It makes sense for it to cluster around the ring and those, but to have a cluster up here, a cluster way over there. That was really interesting, can really tell a lot about, how the late Archaic peoples were using the whole area outside of the ring. All right, and here's just the rest of my artifacts. Some of them more of those historic. I found some pieces of glass. And I should mention too, I'll go back really quickly to this map. So I should mention too, where all of these historic ceramics and historic items are coming from is in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was some sort of structure in this right above where my shovel tests were plotted. Some sort of, I don't know if there's much information about specifically what it was, but some sort of house. It shows up on early coastal survey maps. It shows up on some of the early topos. I know it appears on the 1920, I don't remember exactly which topo. I was looking at it yesterday, but it shows up on the 1920 topographic map, and I would have shown it here. But if anyone knows anything about topographic maps, this area appears right where one map bleeds into another. So when you try to stitch them together, it looks bad, because it's one's from 1920, one's from 1921. They were drawn by two different people, and they just look bad. So I didn't even try with that. All right. But anyways. Okay. So I found some glass, some metal, and then some miscellaneous shell. You can't read too much into that because there's shell all over the place. I was just collecting stuff that, looked interesting for whatever reason, but I still thought I would show it. All right, and then I know I'm running out of time here, so I'll very quickly go through the radiocarbon dating and oxygen isotope analysis. So this is a map here. A, B, and C represents, as we'll see in the next slide, represents my radiocarbon sampling. For A and B, I took two separate samples, one from the top level of the shovel test, one from the bottom level, and then C had one from one specific context. And then these circles are oxygen isotope analysis, which essentially, I went in and micromilled, cut 3 times, and then micromilled bisects of shell, in which you can run it through a mass spectrometer to look at relative oxygen level, oxygen isotope level, which then correlates to, it serves as a proxy for water temperature, which you can use to determine seasonality. So what season of the year a shell was removed and then harvested. So you can use that on a site-wide level to see what time of the year these areas or those shells are being deposited, shells are being used. So here's my radiocarbon dating information. So to read this, so that's going to be the lower level. That's your lower level. That's your top level. So lower level, top level, lower level, top level. And that is for, it has my context. So A down there and B down there. Both of these were pulled from areas that would be considered on that arm of shell. And what you can see is really interesting, which I'll show in a couple slides from here, is that they all come from different periods that we talked about here. So I'll sort of flip back and forth between the two, between this timeline again. But so obviously none date to the same time period, but so what would be considered, what would be right next, this A right here, which is very close to the shell ring, that bottom level dates to the refuge period, which is that early woodland. And then the top level of that shell effect dates to the Deptford period, which is right after. And then you go further out to B, and that lower level dates to the late Deptford, early Wilmington, and then the top level dates to the late Wilmington, St. Catharines, and then that C, which is out there randomly, which I chose because there was like 15 standing grit ceramics all found in one place. That dates to the refuge period as well. So the immediate reaction to this is that, based off what we were talking about earlier, shell was supposed to reemerge at that 350 BC mark, so at the beginning of the Deptford period. But as I've shown here, I have two separate radiocarbon dates of shell, these are of oyster, that both date to the refuge period. So it, poses a massive question of like, if shell wasn't supposed to be there, why is it there? And what interpretations can we make about, some of our understanding of the environment and this, the intricacies of that late archaic or early woodland transition. All right, so here's a plot that. So I flipped them again. So this is from, so this is A and that's B. So you can see how it goes from bottom to top. So bottom to top, bottom to top. So that refuge, Deptford, Wilmington, St. Catharines. You can see as they go, they get older. Then you have that one firmly refuge date. All right. Yeah. So those are my conclusions so far. Obviously, I still need to interpret my oxygen isotope data. I'm trying to nail down a meeting with the person I did that with, but our schedules aren't lining up. But anyway, so my sort of conclusion is I definitely think that based off the criteria I was talking about, the Creighton Island shell ring can definitely be understood as a persistent place. People were obviously either returning or maybe the question of that they were staying, who knows? But this site is being used over time. I have either through radiocarbon dates or ceramics, I have representation from all 6 and 7 into parentheses with Savannah period of the pre-established pre-contact phases on the Georgia coast. And again, so for one reason or another, humans either continuously inhabited or consistently returned to the site and seemingly continued some sort of shell ring / midden construction with that arm of shell, if it's dating to the firmly in the woodland and even the beginning of that Mississippian period. So obviously, I think the first step, because this is just 4 dates. If you count the ones in the arm shell, this is just 4 dates. Obviously, the next step is somebody needs to take more dates. Cough, cough, awesome, cough. And now see if this trend that I've spotted is actually true and can actually line up with further dates. And then also, I think more intensive excavation of that arm of shell could better capture stratigraphic change, indicative of, series. That's one thing. Through all of my shovel tests, I wasn't able to identify, there would be changes from crushed shell to whole shell to crushed shell, but I couldn't find a consistency across the board. So I think, doing a wider excavation would help with that. But yeah, that was a little long-winded, but yeah. Questions?
So what would you just shoot a dart? What do you think it says if the dates are consistent with continued occupation? Where's the shell coming from?
So that's the big question is, if we're finding shell that dates the refuge period, where is it coming from? I think the easy explanation would be, maybe, our understandings of, the appearance and disappearance of the marsh. Because obviously the graphs that I had shown that came from St. Catharines Island, which it's close, it's in the neighborhood, but it's still a little far away. Like, maybe some of our understandings of how the back barrier was operating, isn't necessarily homogeneous across the whole region. That could definitely be true. Maybe there were marshes in the back barrier that were surviving in other places. That's obviously the first conclusion you can make. I mean, without any other evidence, that's what I would lean towards, which then opens up a whole other can of worms of different research and different questions to be asked and answered. So,
I know that there's lots of shell rays all over the coastal area. Do you know how far inland they come and the dating been done? Like, from coast to inland?
I cannot recall if any are actually on the coast themselves. If they are, they're on the coast. I know that, you know, a lot of them come from the barrier islands or directly very near the coast. At least in this area, I can speak to this North Georgia area by itself. I don't believe that any are pretty significantly inland. They're all near the coast. There's one, I wish I could remember it enough to actually describe it, but I remember a graph that is in one report where they mapped all the shell bearing sites in this North Georgia area, and like all of the rings come from the coast, or basically the barrier islands. So yeah, that answers your question. Yeah.
Are you going to continue research on this, like later on, like if you pass semester thesis?
I would love to. At this point, I'm not going for my PhD. That's sort of the decision I made, but I don't know. If somebody else does this work, awesome. I'd love to see how it develops. You know, I think I'm invested at this point. So I don't know if I'll be the one to do it, but I'm hoping that this can be a stepping stone for another person, or you know, several people over the years to really dive into. I think it, yeah.
So just something else about the internet. Do you think that during like periods in which the sea level was falling and people may or may not have stayed, do you think that during between 2300 BC and 1600 BC, people stay behind and deposited shell in a certain area in which would now be covered by the swamp? Because like the shell ring currently is like a sea, so it could have been a complete shell ring at one point.
I've had that question, and short answer, I don't think there's an answer for it. Because I raised the question of, well, obviously now with the radiocarbon dates, we know that's not true, but I think I raised the question at one point, like, well, could have just all of the shell eroded off, and it could have been a whole thing and just eroded and went onto the coast, and Dr. Blair looked at me and said no. Sure. Like I said, I didn't know, it was a shot in the dark. But yeah, that answers that question. But yeah, obviously now with the radiocarbon dates, you know, we know that, you know, if these, you know, again, it's only for, you know, I'm a firm believer in, you know, you always need more evidence to back things up. I don't want to sit here and be like, this is totally what happened, but it looks like, you know, you have consistent deposition over time. Yeah. Okay. Oh, question in the crowd. Oh, that's for comment. Never mind. Okay.
Hang out since are you the organizer of this event? Helping out. You're helping out. We'll be here for our support staff. So Tanvi and I have known each other for a few years. I met her about a year before she decided to come to our program. She sent me an email or something. Yeah, he reached out to me and she hopped in a couple of my anthropology formula classes. And we just been having a conversation for a while, and she decided to she's here. So she's at the end of that journey. Has a really fun project to share with you all about what she's been doing with endometriosis. I'm looking at across different like age categories, the implications of that work moving forward. So it's been awesome to work with Tanvi, and I'm happy to be here today. So present and share with others. Thank you. Thank you all for hanging in there for a little longer. So in my thesis project, I'll be examining the biopsychosocial implications of endometriosis. So endometriosis is a chronic systemic condition. It is characterized by the abnormal growth of endometrial cells that usually grow in the uterus, and then during the normal physiologic cycle, they shed and leave the uterus. However, in endometriosis, as you can see on the picture on the left, they can grow outside of the uterus. And that abnormal growth can go anywhere from outside the uterus in the abdominal area to, it has been shown in the lungs or even other areas of the body. And so during the normal physiologic cycle with endometrial cells, the uterine or the endometrial tissue does not leave the body, and instead it sheds in the area and causes lesions that extend into these sticky connections called adhesions. And that can cause inflammation and also have neurological components as well. So it's a condition that affects 1 in 10 individuals, but is characterized by a diagnostic delay, not only due to the variation in symptoms as characterized by this image, but also due to aspects of stigma. And this stigma has been famously noted by Sear in 2009, when she tried to characterize it by menstrual stigma and menstrual etiquette that follows into normalization of pain and menstrual symptoms, and also concealing of that of menstruation and symptoms extending into menstruation. And so that can also extend into infertility and painful intercourse or dyspareunia, which are both symptoms of endometriosis. And so all of this has been documented to have connections with distress through comorbidities, currently with psychological comorbidities of depression and anxiety. And so within my current study, I'll be looking at what is the lived experience of endometriosis over the life course. Specifically, I'll be focusing in on symptom management, stigma, and stress. So within this, my theoretical focus will be on utilizing the embodied lens and applying it to not only my research question, but also drawing upon Scary and her work on the body and pain, and tapping into how an idea of pain can shape the lived experience. And then also utilizing Martin's work in the women in the body and trying to understand how physicality of the body can shape personhood and identity. And also using Manderson's embodied disruptions, in which the illness is the disruption and can impact the bodily implications, can have bodily implications, and then also impact the sense of self. So my study is centered around Alabama, and I think it's crucial to acknowledge why Alabama in terms of, not only in terms of the medically underserved area, which are characterized here by the pink area, but also the circle, which kind of documents the participants that were in my study. And this sentiment was also echoed within my interviews as participants expressed that they had to travel to get endometriosis care, so surgeries and other aspects of care. So it kind of extends into the reasoning behind by Alabama. So it's not just because I go to the University of Alabama. So within my study, data collection ranged from May to December. I started out with participant observation at UAB at the Women and Infants Clinic, and looking into that, I also was able to provide flyers, not only at the UAB Center, but also other gynecological clinics and other related clinics and community sites, so that participants could access the survey. And then through the survey, they were able to choose and participate based on purpose of sampling in the interview and the body mapping section. So the survey consisted of condition characteristics, so symptoms and diagnosis, and also ranging into symptom management. And then it also had a endometriosis health profile 30, which is a Likert style survey that tries to capture a health-related quality of life, and also it had the perceived stress scale. So after that, participants chose to participate in the body mapping activity, which is a visual method in which the participant either has their body traced or can draw their body or use like a sample of the diagram of the body and then answer questions upon that body map. So like a visual way of answering questions. This was supplemented with semi-structured interviews that lasted about 30 to 60 minutes. And then analysis was done through descriptive statistics
of the endometriosis hopeful about 30, and then the PSS as well, looking at Pearson's correlations. And then the interview and the body map both followed reflexive thematic analysis, in which I coded the body map. So after doing the body map, I would ask the participants to go over it and kind of label their symptoms or symbols and images that they drew. So that was taken in and analyzed through reflexive thematic analysis. So within my sample was characterized by 31 participants in the survey, and then 9 participants in the interview and the body maps. So as you can see here, 4 out of the 5 different age categories were represented in the sample. So I chose to focus in on these specific age categories due to previous studies on health-related quality of life that divided it by those. And also to kind of explore that life force lens that was part of my research question. So within the survey, these are some of the characteristics that were reported. So as you can see, pain was a big symptom alongside some of the GI symptoms, as you can see, and the psychological comorbidities, and also part of the symptom management that was highlighted by the participants was pain medication, but also surgical procedures, and part of it was also diet changes. So within my study, this data currently is some of the preliminary data across the sample, and then later on I'll be focusing in on the specific age categories in the future aspects of my research. So within the symptom management, it was characterized by this, not only managing your symptoms in your day-to-day life, but having to adjust your whole life and life course around the symptoms. So this individual, Bailey, she was 39 years old, and she had to get a hysterectomy for her endometriosis, and that's what her doctor had prescribed her. And then after that, she kind of had to change her life course from being a tenured professor to becoming a remote instructor, and that kind of change was characterized by her change in her sense of self as well, due to wanting to change and move beyond her career. So this aspect of work life impacting trajectory of the life course of that individual, and also causing stress was characterized in the survey as well with the endometriosis health profile survey. The work life was one of the characteristics that was taken into account, and it showed a positive correlation with perceived stress scale as well. Alongside this, in the endometriosis treatment was also characterized by the highest score for all the variables that were taken into account for the health-related quality of life variables. So that score of 66 basically means that out of 100, from 0 to 100, 100 being worse, overall across the sample, 66.7 was the score for treatment. And then the third largest score was feelings of lack of control and powerlessness at 56.3. And this was across the sample. So this impact on life and having to adjust your life was also characterized by Dina, who was 21, and she highlighted how she had to change. So she had this pill cocktail, which was what she labeled her medications and her kind of treatment plan. And then through that, it was hard for her to socially, not wanting to leave the bed for a little bit, or for having to go to class, and that it would be a really, really difficult process. And that a lot of times she felt like crying and incredibly emotional. And just because of how bad the symptoms were, she had to be checked out of school, which was not normal compared to other girls her same age. So the symptom management was also characterized within another body map of Gina, who was 20, and she highlights these little black things that cause her to see things externally that cause her stress when it comes to her pain itself. And then also feeling nervous when having to tell others about this pain and about the future plans that she had for herself. So within this, there was also the impact of stigma, specifically the normalization that happens and the dismissal of the experiences and that transcending and being internalized. So Haley, who was 20 years old, she highlighted that when she had told one of her friends about what she was experiencing, she was just told, just because you feel that way doesn't mean that what you're experiencing is abnormal. So in her head, she thought of it as like, that's exactly what it means. So with that experience, instead of going to the doctor, what she ended up doing was it left an imprint on her, and she was like, okay, I'm just not going to tell people about this if they're just going to tell me I'm overreacting. Now I don't even want to tell an employer, so it extended to other aspects of her life. This body map and this individual, Felicity, who was 28, she kind of highlights how this internalization also extended into other personal aspects of her life. So she depicted that these little pathways with construction on them are just the pathways really for me symbolize these techniques of rewiring of intercourse and intimacy with my husband. Sex created some very negative feedback in my body. Hormonally and in my mind, they're under construction. So hopefully I can rewire them or repave some of these. So she experienced symptoms of painful intercourse alongside her endometriosis. And for her, that stigma against both painful intercourse and not valuing women's experiences around sex were internalized, and they became not only a part of her own journey, but also how she interacted with her husband and her partner. So this kind of aspect of interaction with the other was highlighted within the quantitative data with the impact of endometriosis on social support, and that having a positive correlation with perceived stress. It also was characterized by the impact of endometriosis on sexual relationships and intimacy, and that on with a positive correlation with perceived stress. So moving on to the aspect of distress, this was characterized by the feeling of feeling broken as a woman. So not being able to not only fulfill those gender norms, but also how you feel in your sense of self and connecting to that gendered identity. So within the quantitative data, this was characterized by kind of the experience of pain and positive relationship with perceived stress, and the feeling of lack of control due to endometriosis and having a positive correlation with perceived stress. So I'll try to, I'll be going into more detail about this through the qualitative examples. So Ella, who was 67, she had been on this long journey with endometriosis, and during it, when she was put on Danacrine, which is like a medication that impacts you hormonally, she had this fear of turning into a man, or was it going to give her some terrible outcomes or any side effects that they didn't know about and that she didn't know about. But then later on in her life, when she had a hysterectomy, she highlighted how she had this contentious relationship with her doctor, and when she was going through the hysterectomy, she was asking her physician to keep one of her ovaries so that she could just have a little bit of her own estrogen. So kind of tying in not only in terms of your bodily autonomy and your body being able to produce what it's naturally supposed to be produced societally, but also having that sense of self that you relate to in terms of feeling like a gender, feeling like a woman. And then in terms of Angie, she was also in her late 50s, and she had just had a hysterectomy and was trying to understand and wrap her head around being, not in those fertility years anymore. And then she was talking about how she was through with having babies, but not knowing if she was actually off the grid, and like wondering if the endometriosis was still there after this, and if she would be checked up on by the medical system and receiving care. Within the younger population, Haley, who was 20, was kind of looking forward ahead to her life and had heard these scary statistics about women experiencing, like 40% of the women experiencing infertility issues who have endometriosis. That's another one of those things that, like the little black things, is looming over me. It makes me really distressed to think that this could
could like impact that part of my life. So this, once again, bringing up this gendered identity of what is expected out of women and feeling broken about the future sense of self almost. And then moving on to Felicity again, she kind of characterized what the experience of infertility with endometriosis is like and how that connects to that gendered identity. So she expressed that I'm a woman and I can't bear children. A paradox, like conflicting ideas, but it wasn't a choice. So once again, repeating that constant negotiation between the self and the gendered identity. And then in her body map, she kind of highlights these negative emotions to be applied to those teardrops. So she was talking about being heartless or hopeless and heartbroken. And then in the broken shards up there, she was talking about just feeling and believing that she is broken as a woman. And then these hearts represent her desire to be womanly, to be human, and then to have children and to bear children. She can't reach that potential. So it kind of taps into not only that gendered identity, but extending it into her personhood. And then the last quote, it was one of her experiences when she was being excluded from Mother's Day when she didn't have a kid, and then kind of labeling those experiences as isolating and distressing. So that kind of wraps up the current stage I am at with my research. I'll be heading more into analyzing the data in relationship to the age categories, and then integrating theoretical components and thematic analysis as well, and then writing up my thesis. I want to thank my advisors and Dr. McClure as well, and my committee and all of you for listening.